Now, perhaps it's a character flaw in me, an irrational disposition to root for the underdog, some curious devotion to Saint Jude, the patron saint of hopeless cases and lost causes. But whenever something that I care about becomes popular, I get a little anxious. And I care about spirituality. I care about the human sense of a transcendent power that bears down on us and sometimes bears us up as well. But now that spirituality is popular, I'm a little worried about it. Now, there can be no doubt that spirituality is popular again. I consulted a recent edition of Books in Print, and there were 20 pages of book titles about spirituality. This is not surprising, I suppose, because human beings are inalienably religious beings. There is deep in human experience what John Calvin called a sensus divinitatis, a sense of the presence and power of one on whom we depend in our strength and in our weakness, in our living and in our dying. Human beings simply are religious, and spirituality is as natural to human beings as breathing. So I mean to celebrate spirituality, but I also am a bit suspicious of it. I'm suspicious of spirituality because we human beings are not only remarkably religious, we are also quite remarkably capable of screwing things up, including spirituality. I have 4 worries about spirituality. I worry about the ease with which spirituality is corrupted into magic. And by magic, I do not mean simply a sleight of hand. I mean the attempt to manipulate the divine presence and power to serve the cause of the magician. The effort to turn mystery into a technology to solve a problem, a tool to achieve what we already want, whether what we already want is 14 more healthy years or a fortune. I mean the attempt to turn God to some great scalpel in the sky, some heavenly pharmacopoeia. And my second worry about spirituality is that it's easily confused with dualism. By dualism, I mean the theory or the practice that drives a wedge between body and soul. Dualism divides spirit from the body as though we were 2 things and not one whole, and as if these 2 things did not need each other to be and to be known. My third worry is a temptation in spirituality to elitism. And I remind you of the church at Corinth. There were some extraordinarily gifted people, some extraordinarily spiritual people, but they boasted about their spiritual gifts, or some did, and claimed to have no need of others, including Paul. And Paul reminded them, you will remember, that each one is gifted. He reminded them that each one is gifted for the common good. And he reminded them that the greatest spiritual gift is the most mundane and ordinary of things, namely love. Spirituality can tempt us to pride and to envy and to elitism, especially when it attends to itself rather than to God. Now, if Paul is right, then authentic spirituality has no place for any of that. Like Paul, we should celebrate spirituality, but worry a little bit about elitism. And my fourth worry is, to be frank, idolatry. This quite natural sense of a transcendent presence and power is a veritable factory of idols. Everywhere a good exists, human beings can attach to it an extraordinary loyalty and extravagant expectations. And the monotheism of the Jewish and Christian traditions chastens us with the reminder that this too now is not God, and with the admonition to relate to this too as this too is related to God. Now, life, for example, is a good gift from God. But life can be an idol for healthcare and for Christians involved in it. And health is a good gift, but it can be a very demanding God. And the relief of pain is a good gift. But in the midst of pain, it's nearly impossible to resist the temptation to make it an ultimate concern, to be ready to curse God and damn the neighbor, to do or undo anything, only for the sake of relieving our pain. And technology is a great gift, a great good, but we are easily tempted to expect it to do too much, to be the faithful Savior, to deliver us from our suffering or from our mortality. Now, the problem, as I see it, is not whether to be spiritual or not. Deciding to be spiritual is like deciding whether to breathe for a human being. We can hardly live our lives or die our deaths without some sense of dependence upon some dimly known but reliable power, without some lively sense of gratitude for the givenness and the gifts of life and health, without some sad sense of a tragic flaw that runs through our lives and through our dying and through our efforts to care for the living and the dying, and without some hopeful sense of new possibilities on the horizon, and without a keen sense of responsibility to the inscrutable power who sustains the order and gives the gifts and judges the flaw and provides the new possibilities. The problem is not whether to be spiritual or not. The problem is how to name that power, how to interpret that presence, how to direct those senses, how to live and die in ways that are attentive to the one who has shown himself, how to be faithful to God, how to be spiritual without magic or dualism or elitism or idolatry. And Christians, too, as you know, have sometimes been corrupted by magic and by dualism and by elitism and by idolatry. We are not immune from those dangers. But even so, as Christians, we dare to claim that the one who bears down on us and sustains us has been made known, and to claim, moreover, that it is good news. The good news is not our spirituality. The good news is the presence of the Spirit. The Spirit is present to the dying and to those who would care for them. And attention to the Spirit can reform our spirituality and inform our efforts to be faithful to God in the face of death. Consider the presence of the Spirit. The Spirit was there at the beginning, of course, brooding on the waters of chaos and bringing to birth a cosmos. And the Spirit was there at the beginning, the breath that made the mud a living creature. And the Spirit is still present in the chaos and in the mud, in the waters of our tears, still giving breath and life. The Spirit was there in the hurt, there when Israel took notice of its pain in Egypt and gave its voice, there when the psalmist took note of his suffering and cried out to God in lament, is there when Jesus of Nazareth joined his voice to theirs on the cross, my God, why? And there when, as Paul says, the whole creation groans in travail together. All of these cry out to God in the hope against hope that there was someone there to hear their cry. And the Spirit was there and made the cry its own, made the hurt its own, and answered the pain with promise. So the Spirit was there in the promise then. And when the promise was given token, when Israel was delivered from its bondage, when the psalmist was assured that he would not be abandoned, when Jesus was raised from the dead, and when, but of course this promise is still outstanding, when the whole creation is made new, when death shall be no more, when neither mourning nor crying nor pain shall be any more, when, as Paul says, our bodies will be redeemed. The Spirit is still present in the hurt and in the promise. And to be attentive to the Spirit is still to remember and to hope. And remembering and hoping to struggle against the evils that threaten our embodied life and our common life. So it was with Israel. Memory and hope formed their liturgy, their psalms, their prayers, and then spilled over into all of life. In remembrance, the weak were protected by law, and in hope, the prophets beat against injustice with their words. It was the prophet Isaiah who said, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Spirit has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. The Spirit has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to comfort those who mourn." And those words, of course, were repeated by Jesus and fulfilled in words of blessing to the poor and works of healing for the sick. And when the powers of death and doom had done their damnedest, God raised this Jesus up and poured the Spirit out. So the Spirit was there at Pentecost, coming to the disciples like fire and like wind, so that the power in their lives was a new power. It was God's power, coming to all, so that unlike that scene at the Tower of Babel, people understood each other and cared for each other. And the Spirit is here today and there tomorrow in the chaos of that patient's room. And we can be attentive to it and responsive to it, like Mary, like one humble person ready to let the Word be made flesh in her, ready to rejoice in any little role by which God's intention to bless can take embodied shape. It was good news to Mary, and it's good news to us. It's good news when the humble are exalted, when the humiliated are blessed, when the sick are healed, and when the dying and the grieving are comforted. It's good news when the Spirit, the first fruits of God's good future, is present. So consider then the Spirit's presence in our care for the dying and our faithfulness to God. Note first that we do not create the Spirit's presence. And we do not dispense the Spirit like aspirin. I mean, God doesn't come in little doses. There are no convenient tablets to make God easier to swallow. It doesn't work that way. But with wonder and delight, we may and sometimes do discover that the Spirit is already present and closer than the lashes of our eyes. Now note also that like the lashes of our eyes, we never see the Spirit immediately. Our experience of the Spirit is always mediated, it's always indirect. In our experience of the world and in our experience of others, we sometimes see reflected and experience sometimes the presence and the power of the Spirit. The Spirit is always present, but not as one item among several. It's not as though we could say, now there's the patient, and there's the doctor, and there's the nurse, and there's the monitor, and there's the chart, and there in that corner is the Spirit. The Spirit is always present, but mediated. The Spirit is present to us in and through the presence of others. And the Spirit is present to others in and through our presence. Now, this is stunning and always finally surprising. But it's also mundane and quite ordinary. It was surely surprising, stunning to those in the parable who heard the Son of Man say, "Inasmuch as you were not kind or considerate or even moderately helpful to me, to one of the least of these, you were not kind or helpful or considerate to me." And it was no less surprising to those who heard him say, "Inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me." It's absolutely stunning, but also quite mundane and ordinary. For what they did was nothing more or less extraordinary than give the thirsty a cup of water, or visit the sick, care for those pressed down and crushed by hurt and harm. Nothing more or less extraordinary than simple acts of love. Now, the parable provides an important reminder for people like us that the presence of God is mediated to those caregivers through the patient. That each patient, in her weakness and vulnerability, in his hurt or loneliness, presents a spiritual presence to the caregiver. We stand there sputtering and stuttering. Do you mean to say that that was you, Lord? That fat old fart was you, Lord? That irritating Gomer was you, Lord? And why, she certainly had a rough life. And she was you even so, Lord? I mean, do you really mean to say that broken body was your spiritual presence? The image of God? The face of Jesus? The presence of the Spirit? And the answer is always yes. And that answer calls for a kind of reverence in response, relating to the patient as the patient is related to God. Why, we might even have eyes to see the dignity of those who sit in their own indignity. Now, some patients, of course, have little sense of God's presence in them. And indeed, many have little sense of God's presence to them. Some patients feel like hell. And they sometimes think of themselves as being in hell, in that place where God is not. The presence of God has been eclipsed by their fear or by their anger, by their pain or by their loneliness. It would be good news to them, indeed, if God were present. It would indeed be a ministry to them to signal somehow the presence of God to such a patient, to reflect somehow the presence of the Spirit when God has been eclipsed. And for those who would conduct that kind of health care, or that kind of ministry, then it is also good news that the Spirit is present. Also to those who would minister to the sick and the dying. Because the Spirit is there, we can be too. We need not anxiously substitute for an absent God. We need not accept the intolerable burden of being the Messiah and of making everything turn out right for each patient. The same parable of the Son of Man ought to be enough to remind us that if anyone is the Messiah, the patient is. We need not pretend to be some divine doc, some super nurse, some messianic chaplain. We can ask for help in our helping, help to care for a patient and help to care for ourselves. Attentive to the presence of the Spirit, we are freed from the anxiety of needing to substitute for an absent God. We are freed for a more carefree care. The Spirit's presence is a gift, and we may and we must respond to that gift with gratitude. Gratitude for the patients who in their very vulnerability place us in the presence of Christ. And gratitude for opportunities, great and small, to reflect God's care for them. Sometimes by saving a life. Sometimes by easing their pain. Sometimes by relieving the loneliness of someone's tears. And sometimes it's by wiping their tears with compassion. The Spirit's presence is a reminder that we are gifted, that each one is gifted, and not only with patience, but with opportunities and powers to reflect the presence of God to patients when God has been eclipsed, to make the presence of the Spirit a little less opaque to patients, to mediate in ways awesome and humble the presence and power of God, to be there with and for patients. Such gratitude is a mark of faithful care. Now, the ideal of much health care is philanthropy. The virtue is beneficence. And this is not to be despised, for it commends to the caregiver a love of humankind that issues in deeds of service and love. But it divides the human race. It divides a hospital. It divides the world into two groups: the relatively self-sufficient benefactors and the needy beneficiaries. Now, gratitude provides a different picture and different relationships. A hospital, a world in which each is recipient of gifts, in which human giving is put, as Bill May says, in the context of primordial receiving. Gratitude commends and forms deeds of love and service too, but not as a self-important conceit of philanthropy. Rather as little deeds of kindness which are no less a response to gift than prayers of thanksgiving themselves. Now the patient, remember, was in hell, was without God, it seemed. Evil was having its way. Chaos its victory, and death its triumph. And where in that hell is God? Sometimes in a doctor's care, sometimes in a nurse's word, sometimes in a chaplain's touch, sometimes in a friend's presence that lets the patient notice his hurt and give it voice. Sometimes in the simple favor, sometimes in a kind inquiry about a patient's child or grandchild, but always in love and in such humble works of love. Everything else will pass away, Paul said. But love is already a mark of God's good future and a mark of faithfulness in the face of death. It is not yet that good future, of course. And the power of death has not yet laid down its arms in admitted defeat. And yet already love hopes for that future, and hope loves. The presence of the Spirit does not make liars of us. This has been Pollyanna so far, maybe some of you are thinking. I mean to say the spirit of death does not lay down and admitted its arms. There's no denial of the reality of death or of the terrible hold that it has on some of those who are dying, and ironically, the terrible hold that it has on some of our efforts to cure and to keep alive. Death is real, and it's a real evil because it threatens to separate people from their own flesh and from their communities and from God. Death threatens to sunder us from our bodies. And that threat is real and terrible, for human beings are embodied selves, not ghosts. And we live and move and work and play and eat in our flesh. It's in our bodies that we exercise control over ourselves and some responsible control over the world. And more than that, it's in our bodies that we discover the wonderful variety of shape and color and scent and texture of God's creation. Most of all, it's in our bodies that the site for revelation of one human self to another, in a gesture or a word, in a smile or a tear, in a touch. And the threat of death, you see, makes its power felt when the sick or when the dying are alienated from their own flesh, when they are prematurely sundered from being at home in it. It makes its power felt in the weakness that robs the sick of their capacity to exercise control. More than that, it makes its power felt when the wonderful variety of God's creation is reduced to something barren and sterile, to something dull and colorless and tasteless, to something inhospitable and alien. And most of all, it makes its power felt in the lonely dumbness that is unable to communicate one's identity. Notice this, therefore, that ironically, death can and sometimes does make its power felt in a hospital and in the sort of health care which is technically oriented to biological survival. Death is real, and it's a terrifying evil, but it's not the last word. Because Jesus has been raised and the Spirit poured out, hope loves and love hopes. And the presence and the future of God make its power felt, I think, not where the dying cling desperately to life, and surely not where the dying are deliberately killed, but where dying is faced with courage and accompanied by care. Faithfulness in the face of death practices the presence of God and celebrates the first fruit of the Spirit precisely by attention to embodied selves, by relieving pain, by nurturing the strength of patience to exercise self-control, to be themselves, and by attention, yes, to the delights of the flesh, to the music they like, and to the flowers they love, and to their dining no less than to their diet, and by a human touch which signals compassion. Death also threatens people to sunder people from their communities. And that threat, too, is real and horrible. For human beings are communal selves and not isolated individuals. Human life is a life lived with others, and death threatens separation and exclusion, abandonment, removal. And death makes its power felt when the sick or the dying are removed and separated from those with whom they share a common life. It makes its power felt when their environment is inhospitable to family and friends. It makes its power felt when the disease so monopolizes attention that there's no space for the tasks and the responsibilities of reconciliation and forgiveness and community and just plain fun with the family. It makes its power felt when the fear of being abandoned is not met by the presence of one who cares. So notice this, that ironically, death can and sometimes does make its power felt in a hospital and in the sort of health care that is oriented to the survival of an individual organism and neglects a patient's community. Death is real, and it's a terrifying evil, but it's not the last word. And the presence and the future of God are made known and practiced in care for people in their communities. The first fruit of the Spirit is celebrated by simple hospitality, not only to patients, but to those whom patients love and by whom they are loved, by making those visiting the sick and the dying comfortable and welcome, by ministering to those who can only stand and wait. Because by such hospitality, you see, you care for the patient too, and answer the threat of death, the threat of being sundered from those one loves, with love and hope. Now, death threatens people finally in their relationship with God. And that threat is real and terrifying. For people are religious in spite of the denials of secularism. Death threatens any sense that the one who bears down on us is dependable and caring. Death threatens abandonment by God, separation from God. It threatens human beings in their identity as cherished children of God. And it makes its power felt whenever the sick and dying are not assured of the presence of the loving God who cares. That presence must be mediated, not just mentioned, but to mediate the presence of the Spirit is faithfulness in the face of death. It's not just to shout the prohibition against assisted suicide. It is to be there as some small token of the presence of the Spirit. Faithfulness in the face of death does not pretend to have God under control, does not presume to be able to manage or manipulate God, does not attempt to dispense God in tidy, well-regulated doses, but it recognizes and celebrates the presence of the Spirit and by being present to dying patients in ways appropriate to the presence of God to them, in the humble confidence that neither death nor life shall be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Jesus Christ our Lord.